What a treat to listen to an expert like Torsten, and to give us the wealth of his experience over that enormous 25 years of time. Now, it's 5:45. I realize that, and if you look at your watches, we're about to have our break at 6, but to give the next presenter 15 minutes before we go on a break, that would be kind of a little bit awkward. So I would propose you to sit on your stomach for a little bit longer to be able to listen to our next presenters, and I don't think that you have any hesitation to do so. Let me introduce Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin is the founder and the executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. It's not Google Maps, it's MAPS. And MAPS was there earlier than Google. If you type maps or so, you get Google, but you need... So he received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana, and his master thesis on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill in nausea control for cancer patients. His undergraduate thesis at the New College of Florida was a 25-year follow-up of the classic Good Friday experiment, which evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord prison experiment. Rick studied with Stanislav Grof and was amongst the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goal is to help develop legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as a prescription medicines, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston with his wife and 2 dogs still, I think, and three kids and some empty rooms because they graduated from college school. Now, I got to learn Rick about 3 years ago at the APA, where I was sitting in the audience and Rick was telling about a guy that lived in the Netherlands and he was named Jan Bastiaans. And it's like, wait a minute, I know that guy. So I stood up to the microphone and he said, I know he was in the Netherlands. He was a professor of psychiatry and he treated concentration camp survivors with LSD. He said, let's talk. Now, we didn't stop talking, and we've met over numerous encounters at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and I'm so delighted to have you here with us tonight and hear you talk about MDMA. Rick, the floor is yours.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I do want to say something about Dr. Bastiaans for a question before, about a book called Shaviti, which is an Israeli Holocaust writer who went to take LSD with Bastiaans and then wrote about it. So it's the only account I'm aware of one of the patients describing their own therapy. And relatives of mine in Israel knew the author and knew him before and after the treatment and talked about how helpful it was to him, but also about how difficult it was. And from reading the account, you can see that there's a way in which the memories come back and then you can process them, but there's no fear reduction like there is with MDMA. And so I think reading Shaviti gives you a sense of why we felt to start with MDMA for PTSD. What I want to first explain that we're doing, basically MAPS is a nonprofit pharmaceutical company. And so we focused ourselves on trying to develop psychedelic drugs through the FDA and through the European Medicines Agency. But initially we had to do a strategic analysis. And so what I like to say is that we actually do political science. So with psychedelics, because they were so demonized, stigmatized, and banned, when we had to think about how do we bring back psychedelics into medical practice, and then beyond that, back into our societies, we had to figure out which of all the different psychedelics did it make sense to start with first, and then which of the patient populations did it make sense to start. So what is the most politically strategic patient psychedelic combination? And so the way in which that analysis turned out was that when you think about all the different psychedelics, generally there's the classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, mescaline, iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin. These are ones that are dissolving the ego, and then you have this, what we now know, this reduction of activity in the default mode network, and you have less of a sense of self and more a broader sense. And that's this large class of the classic psychedelics. And then these other psychedelics that have been sometimes referred to as entactogens or empathogens, of which MDMA, MDA, MDA, MDE, those are in that class. And those are gentler and easier for people to integrate. They don't dissolve the ego. And also, one of our main beliefs is that in order for therapists to be more effective in treating patients with psychedelics, that they will learn an awful lot if they take the drugs themselves and at least know what they're experiencing. So in a classic 8-hour or so experience with classic psychedelics, it's around 80 to 90% of the time people have their eyes closed and have their own internal experience, and maybe 10 or 20%, even 20% it seems high, of dialogue with the therapists. But with MDMA, it's more, in an 8-hour session, it's more or less roughly half the time. People are listening to music with their eye shades on, and the other half of the time they're engaged in dialogue. So either way, with the classic psychedelics or with these entactogens and pathogens, MDMA-type drugs, there's an awful lot of time when the therapists are just sitting there and are sort of holding space and are observing body language, trying to figure out what's going on with the patients. And so it was our view that patients would be well served if their therapist had done these drugs. And so when we started trying to figure out how to move forward, most psychiatrists or psychotherapists, at least not those that come from this sort of underground, above ground credentials, but most of the ones that we want to talk about when we talk about mainstreaming would be more reluctant to try themselves LSD or psilocybin than to try MDMA. And also because MDMA is more gentle, what we've heard about from Torsten, that there's just ways in which it's easier to integrate. And so I felt that of all the psychedelic drugs, the one that we should start with is MDMA. And then when we try to think about what are the different patient populations, this is where, again, the politics comes in. We have to pick a patient population for whom the general public is sympathetic. So psychedelics are terrific for addiction. There's been a lot of work, in the early 50s and 60s, and the modern work with psilocybin, with alcoholism, with even cocaine addiction. There actually is a study right now in England with MDMA for alcoholics on the theory that if you reduce the trauma that drives people to escape, then you can reduce their use of substances for escape purposes. But there's been, in general, the addicts are the other. So we sort of disown them, and so that even though psychedelics are terrific for addiction in certain ways with enough support, that's not the ideal population to begin with. So we settled on two basic groups. One would be people with life-threatening illnesses who are anxious or depressed or scared of dying, basically. So that's all of us. We're all about, worried about dying to some extent, and we all identify we will all die. And so that's a really good population to work with. There's also the advantage early on in the 80s and 90s, we were thinking about when we were battling this whole question about neurotoxicity, when people were funded by NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, and others to do neurotoxicity research, they were starting to get more and more to this idea of one dose, serious brain damage, major functional consequences, and so this drug should never be studied in people at all because they knew it was too dangerous, which was false. But there was this idea that if we worked with cancer patients, that they wouldn't live long enough, a lot of them, to show evidence of neurotoxicity. So that we already, because as time went on, from the use in the middle 70s to the middle 80s, those people that used it a few times in therapy or even in non-therapeutic settings didn't show any obvious problems. So the theory then became that there's a time bomb, that the period of aging will natural decline, and then somehow these people that have these injuries from even 1 or 2 doses of MDMA, they'll age and then they'll start showing the time bomb theory. They'll start showing problems. So we thought we could work with cancer patients who weren't going to have a long time necessarily to live, and that would help us address this neurotoxicity question. And then the other was to think about post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in America, we have this way in which we I wouldn't say idolize, but we have great respect for veterans, for people who are in the Army and the military. And there's just still an enormous number of people from the Vietnam War who still have PTSD. And we just needed not only sympathetic patient population, but also a patient population for whom other treatments left a large group treatment resistant, so that there was a great need, great sympathy for the patient population. Also, victims of rape, of childhood sexual abuse, those could be anybody, and it's also something that for which generally we have sympathy for that patient population. So we started out initially trying to do MDMA work with cancer patients, and then we shifted to do MDMA for PTSD once the concerns about neurotoxicity declined to the point where we could move forward. I think there's more difficulties from a regulatory perspective to work with cancer patients. There's this fear of death, and this loss of fear of death doesn't map directly onto depression or anxiety measures. Actually, the group that did a lot of work with psilocybin, the Hefter Research Institute, originally at Hopkins and NYU, they tried to develop a new measure called psychosocial distress for the fear of death, and the FDA rejected that as an outcome measure. So there's regulatory challenges. So all of that has kind of led us to this idea that MDMA is the drug most likely to make it through the system first, and PTSD is the patient clinical indication that for which we have the American public, the American regulators, we can most likely get bipartisan support for doing work with that group. So that's how we ended up with basically our basic position for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And as it's turned out, we are in phase 3, the final stage of research to make a drug into a medicine, and the psilocybin groups are in phase 2. So I think that this political analysis has really proven accurate. And so that's sort of this political science, the big frame of how we're doing it. Let's see. I'm not sure how to do this. Is it? I don't think. Is it activated? Oh, it's off. Okay. Okay. All right. So now I want to explain what our structure is, what our corporate structure is, and so where the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is, also MAPS Europe will be once we get a bank account. And it's really up and functioning. But so not only are we trying to model a new approach to psychotherapy, which is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, so a combination of pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy, but we're also trying to model a new way to market drugs. And I think it's more the case in America than here in Europe, where you have national healthcare systems, that we have our whole healthcare system warped in pretty wasteful and terrible ways by the profit motive. And we see a lot of times pharmaceutical companies that are just trying to extract the most money they can from their drugs, charging enormous amounts of money, and we just see a lot with the increase in costs of drug prices. So what we think is that the profit motive in healthcare in particular is really not very good. And also when we talk about watching what's going on with the legalization of marijuana around the world. There's a lot of concerns about what happens when big alcohol and big tobacco start buying up marijuana companies, which is actually happening now. And you start getting people worried about how they're going to market and what they're going to do. And if they do the way that they've marketed alcohol and tobacco, it could end up being a lot of externalities, a lot of unnecessary drug abuse, a lot of problems about how they market the drugs. So what we've done is adopted a modification of capitalism that's now getting more and more popular in the United States and elsewhere as well, that is called the Public Benefit Corporation. So in a for-profit company, you're legally obligated to maximize profits. And shareholders in those companies can sue and replace the management if they feel that the management is not maximizing profits. And so that's where this drive to maximize profits a lot comes from. So a new corporate structure, the Benefit Corp, has been created where what you do is you maximize public benefit, not profit. And you have to articulate what are these benefits. And I think, for reasons maybe we'll get to a bit later, just the necessity of integrating psychedelics into our culture at this time of great crisis, where I think we really need to heal from trauma. We need to feel our connection with other people, the spiritual aspects of it. I think it's really essential that we succeed and that we bring these psychedelics back up from the underground into this second psychedelic revolution, and now the third one that we're going through. And so I think that this idea of modeling a new way to market drugs makes regulators more comfortable, makes the medical community more comfortable, makes the media more comfortable. And so basically what we have, this structure, is that donors, and we're all funded now by donations. In the history of MAPS, over the last 33 years, we've raised $70 million in donations, much of it just in the last year and a half. And so people make donations to MAPS, and we have affiliated organizations around the world that we work with where people in other countries can donate to those organizations in their own countries, and they'll use the resources for our research or transfer it to MAPS. But people make the donations to MAPS, and then MAPS invests in the Public Benefit Corp. And the Public Benefit Corp is the one that's actually doing the research and will be the entity that sells MDMA by prescription post-approval, should we get approval for that. And so then whatever money is made on the sale of MDMA is something that will be used according to the mission of MAPS. So there's no private gain in here, but there is a sort of a virtuous cycle where the more that people donate, the more we can advance the research, the more the research advances to the point where we may actually have products to sell, and then the sale from those products then can further the research, so that we have a different kind of story to tell to donors, which is that unlike most nonprofits, like if you were trying to feed the hungry or build houses for the homeless or all sorts of social needs, those are continual and there's no product at the end. So we're able to tell donors, if you can help us with these very large numbers of dollars that we need to make these drugs into a medicine, that there's a way in which it's a temporary donation, and eventually we'll be able to do further research out of the profits from the sale of these drugs. These drugs will also eventually become generic, and I'll explain a bit how there is these programs that have been created to provide incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. So I think that this is actually going to work out pretty well. And so that's who MAPS is. We're now about 55 people separated out into the two different groups. So this is the MAPS group. We do our executive team, we have fundraising, communications, public education, media, our operations, and then Zendo Project is psychedelic harm reduction. Here we're sort of following what's going on in the Netherlands at the parties where there's drug checking to make sure people know what drugs they're actually getting. And then we have teams of psychotherapists and volunteers that assist people who are using these drugs recreationally but get into psychologically difficult spaces. And then we have these spaces at Burning Man, at Boom Festival in Portugal, and all over the world where we're providing a way to help people integrate, even though they intended initially just to have a recreational experience, but it gets deeper, and so that's our Zendo project. And then we have a bit of our political team that does advocacy. So we have more people now in the Benefit Corp. So our clinical research team is in the Benefit Corp, and what makes me really happy and both historically meaningful is that we have a group of what we call the refugees from Big Pharma. And these are people that used to work for Novartis. And what's sweet about that is that Novartis is the company that bought Sandoz, where Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD and then eventually extracted 15 years later the psilocybin from magic mushrooms. So we have kind of the legacy from Big Pharma going from Sandoz to Novartis, and then so about 5 or 6 of our core team used to work at Novartis. Now, in addition to that, we also have our researchers. So we have trained over 80 people that are working on our phase 3 studies for FDA. And so these are our principal investigators from all the different sites that we have in Israel, Canada, and the US for phase 3. And then we're also now training more people for Europe. So we've had a whole series of training programs. So I just want to give you a sense of how large it's getting. This was our training last September, October here in the Netherlands to train people for Europe. And at this stage now, we're training 50 therapists every 2 months. Now, I'll go in these large, what we call Part B. I'll explain a bit later, but these are the week-long programs where people watch videotapes of the therapy sessions, talk about our treatment manual and our method, and then have discussions about the different interventions that the therapists have done. Why'd they say this? Why didn't they say that? And we find that this is particularly good. And so we're able now to train. This is easy in a way, because this is just 2 trainers and like 2 assistants, and we can do 50 people in one week. But then we have other portions of the training that take more intensive work. We also are able to give people MDMA as part of their training in legally FDA-approved protocols. So what we've had to do is to really figure out how do we go beyond fears that have been generated in the public, mostly by prohibitionists, sometimes by pseudoscientists, occasionally by scientists. This was on APRA in 2001. It's amazing how many people still believe that MDMA causes holes in the brain. This was a graphically manipulated image, and so this was a SPECT scan, which reports on blood flow in the brain. And so what they did is they picked an arbitrary cutoff period, and every area of the brain that had blood flow below this level, they showed as a hole. So Oprah knew that this was not true. We worked with her staff before she, I don't know how much she knew, but her staff knew that these were fake images. They'd also were shown on MTV, but she showed them anyway. And so 10 years later, Oprah made atonement a little bit. And so O Magazine, she did an article on the therapeutic use of MDMA, and she had one of her reporters, who was a senior editor for O Magazine, actually volunteered to take MDMA in an illegal underground therapy setting and wrote about it in the article. So there's just like one sentence about how it was underground, and the rest of it was about the experience that she actually had, which she ended up saying was very, very positive. So this was the graphic image for that article. So this is, of course, propaganda in the positive side. You know, this is MDMA as a magic pill, you know, this glowing magic pill. But that's what we've had to sort of shift. As part of this effort to mainstreaming, we've had to help overcome this enormous amount of fear that has been generated. And it's not to say that there aren't risks or, you know, that there are issues with neurotoxicity from heavy dosing things, but how did we manage to do this? And it's really, in our society, it's really, at this point, I'd say that the most important religion is science. And what we have in the media, there's no way that we could ever purchase advertising or make up for the enormous amount of misinformation that has been spread. But media publishes reports about science. So we end up leveraging our small resources to do scientific studies, get them published in journals, and then the media will spread it. So it's earned income, earned media, which actually people believe more than the ads anyway. So really science has been the key towards changing these perceptions. And this was one of the ones that I really liked recently, Lucy in the Sky with Doctors. Marijuana meant medical, then mainstream. Are psychedelics next? And this was the quote from this particular article. As the marijuana debate shows, attitude shifts that barely seem possible can sometimes become inevitable. I don't think we're quite there at this stage of inevitable because we're in the midst of still the most challenging part of what we had to do, which is these phase 3 studies. But I do think that if we get really clinically significant, statistically significant results in phase 3 and don't discover any new safety problems, that the therapeutic use of MDMA and then psilocybin and other drugs will be inevitable. So for PTSD, as I said, we had to pick a drug patient combination, drug condition, and that most of the treatments worked for some but failed for a large population. So for PTSD, we have only 2 drugs approved by FDA or EMA, Zoloft and Paxil. And those drugs tend to only address symptoms. They don't get to the root problem, and they have a large amount of side effects, and they have a large number of treatment-resistant people. There are psychotherapies that are really good for PTSD, prolonged exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, and yet these require people to confront their traumas. And a lot of people, that's too painful. And so there's a lot of dropouts, and there's a lot of people that just can't find any kind of relief from any of the currently available medications. Just to give, this is a couple years old now, almost 3 years old, but at this point in time, there was 868,000 veterans in the United States that were considered disabled with PTSD by the Veterans Administration, disabled enough to the point that they are receiving monetary compensation on a monthly basis, generally for the rest of their lives. And these are mostly young people who are into the military. There was another roughly 550, 60,000 people that had disabilities for anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders. I don't have a slide for it, but I managed to get some data recently from the VA, the Veterans Administration. There's now, as of about 4 months ago, 1,037,000 veterans receiving disability payments for PTSD. So I don't know what the numbers here are in the Netherlands, but it's an enormous problem. And the last time they put out a number of what it cost, the VA did, it was in 2005. It was congressional testimony, and what they said is that it was $20,000 average annual cost for a veteran on disability. And so if those numbers are the same, which I don't know if they are, it would be $17 billion a year that the VA is paying just for disability payments for PTSD and $29 billion for all these mental disorders. And the thing to keep in mind here is that these are mostly young people. There's a bunch of Vietnam vets here, so they're not all young people, but the increase over the last decade has been from Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were mostly young people. So these are costs that are going to go on for decades and decades and decades. So it's just a tragic situation. This doesn't really, this slide doesn't really even show the suffering. What people are going through. It's just the monetary cost of war. So in order to move forward, what we really needed to do was, first off, develop a therapy to go with the MDMA, because we really do not believe that the MDMA is inherently healing all on its own. Of all the psychedelics, I would say that MDMA is the most inherently healing, but we've talked to a bunch of people who have taken MDMA at raves, in recreational settings, have had past trauma emerge, and have been with people that they felt that they couldn't talk to about it, that their friends just wanted to have fun, that they thought it would bring them down to tell them about these stories. They stuffed their feelings down, and then they felt worse for weeks, months, and years later. So it's not the drug that's the therapy, it's the context that's more important than the drug. And so we had to, in order to work with FDA and to work and do clinical research, we needed to manualize and standardize the therapy. And so we actually call it inner-directed therapy, to go along this idea, as Torsten was saying, that it's directed by the person. They're actually healing themselves, and there is this sense of this inner healer. So we all know that when our body gets injured, there's these mechanisms by which it tries to restore the original shape. But that's below our conscious control. We don't actually know how that happens, but we know there's a self-healing mechanism in our body. And so we hypothesize, even though we can't see it, that there is a similar self-healing mechanism in the psyche. And that when you give LSD, or which Stan Grof, I'd say the world's leading psychedelic researcher, who's about to turn 88 soon, he said that LSD is a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious, that you can't predict ahead of time what's going to come up, but that while it itself is non-specific, what comes up in any individual person is something that's emotionally charged that they're dealing with, and that there is this fundamental belief that there's an order at which things emerge into awareness. We're not consciously aware of why things are that way, but as the therapist, our job is to support people in dealing with whatever is coming up. And a lot of times it comes up in the body, where people don't have the either the ability, or it's too scary to come up consciously in a particular incident, but a lot of things come up either in the body or in the mind. And we encourage people to experience and express whatever it is in whatever order it comes in, on this belief that there is this sort of inner healing intelligence that's bringing things to the surface. And so we do find that there's all different orders. Some people go straight to the trauma. Some people go to happy memories that they draw strength from, then they go to the trauma. Some people, nothing happens, but they have all these pains and sensations in their bodies that they can't identify. So in any case, we just try to support that. And so this is up on our website if anybody wants to read it. It's a lot more detailed than I just expressed, but it's that fundamental concept that the therapists are followers, not leaders, and that they follow what's emerging. That they will occasionally direct by different things that they say to try to focus people's attention, but it's really following issues and emotions and feelings that people have brought up. And we sent this in to the National Institute of Mental Health, and Tom Insel, who was the head of NIMH for a long time, had done MDMA neurotoxicity research, and I'd gotten to be respected. We had mutual respect, and he ended up sending this manual to the manual people at the NIMH, and they said, it looks like a manual. This is our manual. So that was the first part of doing research. Then this is our treatment, in essence, is that over a period of 3.5 months, we give people MDMA only 3 different times, once a month. Basically, it says 3 to 5 weeks apart, but we try to get it more or less a month apart. And it's 8-hour sessions with a male-female co-therapy team. Now, we're not super rigid about that. Sometimes it could be 2 females. We've never had 2 males. Obviously, women who've been sexually abused would rather, would feel more comfortable often if there's a woman in the room. But we also find that about 80 to 90% of the people that are traumatized recover on their own. So there's only a small group of people who are not resilient enough that move from trauma to post-traumatic stress disorder. And those people tend to have a series of traumas in their life, often going back to childhood and different kind of attachment issues. So this well-functioning male-female team often provides support that people didn't get when they were growing up. So that's one of the basic reason. It also provides safety to have 2 therapists there, plus they're 8-hour sessions. And so we always want one person there, so somebody goes to get something to eat or goes to the bathroom or just needs to take a little bit of a break. We always want some person there. But it's embedded, as Torsten was saying about their group work, in a long-term psychotherapeutic process. So we have 3 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions before the first MDMA session, and then 3 90-minute integrative sessions after each MDMA session. So there's basically 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions and 3 8-hour MDMA sessions. And for the MDMA sessions themselves, we encourage, and in most of our sites, we require people to spend the night at the treatment center so that it's an overnight stay as well. And that's to permit people to rest, to recuperate, to integrate. And also, MDMA, more so I'd say than LSD or psilocybin, tires people out physically. And so we very much think about MDMA at least as a 2-day experience, where the second day is to have nothing scheduled for rest, for reflection, for integration, for psychotherapy. And so having people spend the night is very, very helpful. They don't have to get out in traffic. They don't get distracted. And then they're right there. They can sleep longer in the morning, and then the therapists come back for the next day integrative psychotherapy. So now, what we found, though, is that for most people, it seems like they only need 2 sessions. And so the standard model, we think, will be 2 sessions. There's not just healing PTSD, but there's also healing multi-generational trauma, which is the way conflicts get passed down the generations. And so this is Richard Rockefeller from the Rockefeller family. He became my main thought partner for years. He tragically died in a plane crash 5 years ago, but he was the chairman of the board of advisors of Doctors Without Borders. And he became sensitized to Kosovo and Serbia and all sorts of refugees, which we see even more now all throughout Europe and in America. It's such a big issue as well, that there's loads of people that have PTSD, but also these conflicts get passed down the generation. So he came to us, and what he said was, what is your biggest problem? And I said, it's trying to work with the military to get them, because they've got the problem, but they're scared politically. So we had some meetings in the Pentagon, which was really amazing. I took this picture, amazing for me, because I was a Vietnam War draft resistor. So to be able to go into the Pentagon was great. That's Richard on the light, and Michael Mithofer in the center is our lead psychiatrist. Richard's cousin was Senator Jay Rockefeller on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and he got very involved, and we had meetings that he helped arrange in the Pentagon, and then also with the head of the Veterans Administration. This is Lori Sutton, who is the highest-ranking psychiatrist in the Army. Brigadier General. She's now in charge of Veterans Affairs for the City of New York, and this was sort of the call to action from her. When it comes to the health and well-being of those who serve, we should leave our politics at the door and not be afraid to follow the data. There's now an evidence base for this MDMA therapy and a plausible story about what may be going on in the brain to account for the effects. So she's our sort of highest-ranking person in the military that's advocating for us. But in order to educate the VA, the Veterans Administrations, what we had to do is, and this is again part of the political strategy, is we had to contact the world's leading VA researchers who have focused on PTSD, not just at the VA but around the world. And then we've actually are paying for studies for them to blend MDMA with their non-drug psychotherapies. So while we have our own treatment manual, we don't necessarily say it's the best one. We think it's the best, that's why we've developed it, but it's very possible that you could blend MDMA with cognitive behavioral therapy or prolonged exposure and somehow or other optimize those. And maybe you just need one MDMA session or something like that. So this is a big part of mainstreaming, is to work with the mainstream PTSD experts, particularly those connected to the military. And so our first project was with Candace Monson, MDMA-assisted cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So that's conjoint means couples or dyads, where one has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. And that has proven tremendously successful because we give both members of the dyad or couple MDMA. And the primary outcome measure is the PTSD in the person that has PTSD, but we are doing all sorts of measures of couples therapy. So the sad part, just to say, is that couples therapy or couples relationships is not a disease. Feels that way sometimes, but we're not able to make MDMA into a medicine for couples therapy. We can't get that through the FDA. You can't make a medicine out of personal growth. It has to be, clinical diagnosis. And so this was a way to sort of backdoor into couples therapy. We're working with Barbara Rothbaum into combining MDMA with prolonged exposure. I didn't have time to make a slide, but also Edna Foa, who invented prolonged exposure, is now interested in doing a combination as well in Israel. And we're working with Ann Wagner, who works with Candace to develop a combination of MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And we're also working at Yale with Ben Kelmendi, he's got independent funding, but he's looking at MDMA in scanners. And so this is the closest that we're coming to actually studying MDMA by itself without therapy. So people have said you're varying the dose of MDMA, but you're not really varying the dose of therapy. So our approach has been, what do we do to maximize therapeutic outcomes? And so what Ben is going to be doing, we felt this was the minimum amount of therapy. So it will be PTSD patients who are getting MDMA and are then going into a scanner. And they spend an hour in the scanner, but they're still rest of the time while they're on MDMA. And they are PTSD patients. So they're going to have very minimal introduction to MDMA in one preparatory session. Then they're going to have this experience in the scanner where when they're not in the scanner under the influence of MDMA, they'll be with therapists who will talk to them, and then they'll have maybe one integrative session afterwards if they need it. Now, if they really need it, if they get activated, they can call for more therapy, but this is sort of the closest we're going to see to what does MDMA do by itself. It's still a supportive setting, but if you've ever seen scanners or been in a scanner, being in a scanner is not that good of a supportive setting. It's kind of noisy. But anyway, this is what we're trying to do there. So we presented our data to the FDA on all of our phase 2 studies. It took us 30 years from the start of MAPS in 86 to the end of 2016 to get this data in PTSD patients, 107 of them. So the placebo group is people that get therapy, the same approach that I showed you, but without active MDMA. And so still 23% of chronic, severe, treatment-resistant people no longer had PTSD 2 months after the last experimental session, which for this population is really pretty good. And it shows basically that our therapists are trying as hard as they can, whether it's MDMA or not. And so when you add MDMA, though, it more than doubles to 56% no longer have PTSD. But the even better news is that once people learn that they can process their trauma, that they don't have to keep suppressing it, that they don't have to keep running away from it, they keep getting better on their own. And so the 1-year follow-up showed 2/3 people no longer have PTSD, and this other 1/3, most of them actually had clinically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms, even though they still qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. So on the basis of that, FDA said we could go to phase 3. We engaged in what they call the special protocol assessment process, where you negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design. And if you manage to come to agreement, you get an agreement letter, and that means FDA is legally bound to approve the drug if you get clinically significant and statistically significant evidence of efficacy and no new safety problems. And the safety of MDMA is well characterized, multiple decades with tens and tens of millions of people having tried it. So we know the 1 in a million side effect or the 1 in 500 side effect of hyperthermia from raves or drinking too much water, dying from hyponatremia. So we're not likely to be surprised by side effects. And on the basis of this and the lack of other treatments, we got breakthrough therapy from the FDA, which is for the most promising drugs. Then we published a paper in the Lancet Psychiatry about our work with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So again, this is political science. We really wanted to work with veterans, but I said, let's just put in the title that it's for veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So that we're sort of sending the message that this is for the first responders, this is for the establishment, this is for the mainstream. But we didn't actually think we would get any firefighters or police officers, but we actually got firefighters, including one that was at 9/11 in New York on that. They had PTSD from that, and we got one police officer too. So on the basis of this, we gave the New York Times an exclusive, and they wrote an article the day that this was published, and then that article motivated Fox News. So it's really important to cite. For those of you that don't know, Fox News is sort of the arm of the Trump supporters. We received a $1 million pledge from Rebecca Mercer, and the Mercer Family Foundation are the ones that funded Trump and Bannon. They own Cambridge Analytica, which is the one that stole the data from Facebook and used it to micro-target voters, and they also are minority shareholders in Breitbart.com. So the fact that we got support from her gave Fox News, and let's see if we can start this.
According to a new study, soldiers with PTSD using the illegal drug known as MDMA or ecstasy cured the condition within weeks. This is key because I don't think I've ever seen the word cured in a highfalutin medical journal. Usually it's significantly improves, but never cures. Now, the study was small, 26 patients, But the message is big. When a substance has a real effect, meaning it changes you, it also frightens people. Drugs like ecstasy are illegal because they work. And when things work, they are hijacked for other purposes, to have fun, for example, and then people die from taking too much. And that's when the law breaks in and bans it. This has happened to many substances that could have helped millions of people. Just decades ago, MDMA showed real promise in psychotherapy. Then it got banned. But times are changing. We realize it's absurd to punish a substance and a patient because the substance has potential for abuse. Instead, let scientists test them on various hard-to-treat illnesses.
Jesse, did you ever think you'd be doing a pro-ecstasy segment on Fox News?
No, my mind's spinning right now, and I haven't taken any ecstasy.
So we've also had publicity from right to left and a lot of the military stuff. Very briefly, because I know we're on time. So this is our therapy training program. So basically, it seems like a co-therapy team can treat maybe 30 people a year. Because if there's 2 to 3 MDMA sessions, all these non-drug psychotherapy sessions, we don't want therapists to burn out. In America, there's 8 to 10 million people with PTSD, so we're going to need loads and loads and loads of therapists to adequately meet the need. So our first part is 14-hour online. Then part B is this week-long training that I showed you the pictures of. Part C is where people can actually take MDMA under supervision. However, we really want to welcome skeptics, and we don't want to require anybody to take a drug. So this part is optional. So if people don't want to actually take the MDMA, they're going to have to come and sit for somebody else who's as part of our other team, so that they sit for a new therapist getting their training. But it's not optional. But I mean, it is optional, but it's very encouraged. Then we have role play that they have to do, videotape and send it back to our teams. And then the last part is that therapists have to work with one PTSD patient in the treatment method that we described here, and then under supervision, so they get actual feedback between the first, second, and third MDMA session from our therapy team about how they're doing. And that's the thing that we're trying to set up here in Europe. So what we're trying to do is initially, so we've agreed with EMA to move forward in Europe, and now we have to get separate country permissions to do an open label protocol where the therapy teams get practice with MDMA, and then hopefully middle, let's say March, April, something of 2020, we hope to start the controlled study here in Europe. So that's our training team. We do think that patients should know whether their therapists have done the drug or not. It's going to be optional, but there's one diploma that's for people that have not done the MDMA, and then there's another diploma for people that have done it. This actually was for a TV show, so it's really important that, and they wanted us to make a certificate to put on the wall of their their MDMA therapist. So I've talked about the research going on. We think MDMA will be through the system in 2021, at the end of 2021, but the FDA has a program called expanded access or compassionate use. And what that means is that if you have a disease, nothing has worked for you, nothing that's legally available has worked for you, and there's a drug that's being studied for that indication, there are opportunities for you to have access to that drug, but it's at your own cost, because the pharmaceutical company, in this case MAPS, is not able to use the data for the FDA because there's no control group, and it has to be at your own risk because it's not through the FDA. So that's what we're training people for now. We've got a protocol into the FDA. They've indicated, as has the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, that they will permit expanded access. The largest program of expanded access that FDA ever had was about 1,100 patients, and that was childhood epilepsy. That was CBD for childhood epilepsy. And so that was Epidiolex by GW Pharmaceuticals. And so while they were doing the study, they only needed a certain number of people, but the parents said, we want to treat our kids. And so they created this permission through expanded access. So while we're talking about the end of 2021 for this as a prescription medicine, psychedelic clinics with MDMA being offered to patients, and they have to be treatment-resistant PTSD patients, will be able to start this year. And those same clinics are going to probably expand to being offering ketamine. Eventually, they'll offer psilocybin and other drugs. So the vision of this is these psychedelic clinics the big question, again, for mainstreaming is how do we address the concerns of the regulators about post-approval? How is this controlled? Because most drugs that are approved by the FDA or the EMA, all physicians can prescribe them off-label, meaning for other things than for which they were approved for. So we don't think that that's appropriate for psychedelics because it's not just the drug, it's the drug-assisted psychotherapy. So what we've proposed and what FDA and DEA have both accepted and are very comfortable about is this idea that the only people that are going to be able to prescribe and treat patients are people that have been through our training program and have learned the method that we've taught. That doesn't mean they're stuck with our method. They can innovate, but they know the basics of how did this become a medicine. And it's only going to be administered under direct supervision in a clinic setting. It's never going to be a take-home drug. So those are the two main aspects of these risk evaluation. The other things are that there's going to be a centralized pharmacy, so that this centralized pharmacy is shipping the drug only to the prescribers, not to the patients. And they'll have a list of people that we've approved through our training program. And if you're not on the list, you can't prescribe the drug. And also, because when you roll out something new and that is controversial into society, you want it to work well at the very beginning. And if there's patients that get sexually abused by their therapist, or there's patients that are ignored by their therapists, or people aren't getting the proper treatment, that could make a backlash against this. So we're going to have patient bill of rights, we're going to have complaint forms, we're going to have all different ways to gather information. So I just got a few more slides. Okay. I get the message. So the things below the line are things that we have not agreed to, have not been asked of us, and hope we don't have to do, which is a patient registry where you keep track of every single patient. That is something that is for thalidomide. So thalidomide was the drug prescribed for morning sickness. It caused a lot of birth defects. Now it's useful for leprosy and certain kinds of cancer. So there is a patient registry. So, and the other thing we're also hoping to avoid is a lifetime limit of doses. But if the FDA or EMA requires that, that's fine. Because if you've taken 10 to 12 MDMA sessions for PTSD and you didn't get better, it's not working for you. You should try something else. I mean, people could keep on learning from it. I myself have done MDMA about 130 times. My wife and I try to do it once a year. Not more than once a year, though. Or, well, maybe. But not much more than once a year. So in any case, that's the risk strategy. So these are our locations for FDA studies. We've met with the European Medicines Agency. They've agreed to accept the FDA data and the same design. And so these are the places that we're hoping to do the work in Europe. And eventually this idea of psychedelic clinics. So there's more than 14,500 drug abuse treatment centers, more than 6,000 hospice centers, 33,000 yoga and Pilates studios. This is just in the US. So this is just to say that there's going to be thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands of psychedelic clinics one day. This is one of them in the future. Here's another one, more a budget one. And you will go to Google Maps and you will put in where are the psychedelic clinics, and this is what you'll get, and then you'll do the same in Europe, and there'll be all these psychedelic clinics. And this is just to say that it was invented in 1912. It's off patent, and so more than, I would say, 110 years after it was invented, it will become a prescription medicine. Thank you.